Hey guys, Legacy here. So, what I wanted to get to today was what prompted me and what struggles I had in getting into a Master's of Divinity for pastoral counseling. And I'm sure you're aware, as most of us are, there is a conversation happening, whatever spectrum, side of the spectrum you're on, about gender. And this conversation isn't sexism, it's what's gender? Is it important? Does it matter who is male? Does it matter who is female? And do those carry certain roles? These things have been consistently challenged um, over the course of history, specifically biblically. You see a lot of representations of women that are completely countercultural to the times that they were given. And that's important to note, okay? Because historically, women were held down. They were less educated because they weren't allowed to be educated unless they were wealthy or royal. And you had a very small section of jobs that you could do, positions that were open as a woman. And so most often you hear of concubines and sex slaves, and that was just common. Women were um, stolen and married off and promised to be married. Child marriage was real and in some cultures still practiced today. So women have had such a hard time historically, uh, and especially when we look at religious affiliations and female roles. So I was really worried about that when I felt the call, when I felt the inspiration to go into this. Concerned. I've been a Christian for a long time. Do I even believe that women should be in higher roles? Do I even believe that God is really calling me, or am I just crazy? So we will talk about inspiration later. That's a big topic, but I'm just focusing specifically on this issue of male female orientation just within the church. And one of my personal problems was that I only ever saw women working with children. I only ever saw women working with other women. I only ever saw women doing management or working at a desk or being a greeter or being a prayer coach or whatever. There's tons of different ways that women help church communities, and none of them should be taken for granted. However, uh, what about the women who don't like to deal with kids? What about the women who don't want to greet strangers at the door? Maybe that's not their bag. Oh, it's not my bag, baby. Anyway, uh, all of those things came to mind for me because, I have heard other men say, oh, well, women can't be deacons, they can't be elders, they shouldn't even preach, all of this stuff. And there's some biblical support there because of the cultural history of women at that specific time. Again, less education. You're being sold into either slavery or marriage, right? Um, and you just have to deal. You just have to deal with whatever you're given. Uh, and what you will discover most often, if you understand the history at that time, is that biblical representations of women were often very countercultural to what was happening. And when I went to my leaders, because of course, if you have a question that you're struggling with, one of the first places you want to go is people you trust. And I would hope that you trust your Christian community, whether that meets in a church building or that meets in your house, whatever it is. Go to someone you trust and say, hey, I'm dealing with this. So I go to a couple of gentlemen that I trust. Hey, I'm feeling the call for this, but how do you feel about women in ministry? What does that look like to you? How do you feel about it? And I didn't have a single bad answer. Each one of the gentlemen that I asked their opinion, they were slow to speak, they were kind, they were loving, and they were also knowledgeable. There are a lot of female representations, like I said in the Bible, that are countercultural, and there are female prophets and there are female teachers, and they are mentioned, they are prominent, but we don't often talk about them because the point of the Bible is to teach you about Jesus, right? So we need fringe conversations and fringe topics that address some of the underlying cultural things that we read that's happening, right? So I ended up doing my own research. Again, those gentlemen were very encouraging and supportive, and obviously I ultimately took the plunge. But here I'll tell you, at least in the Old Testament, I got my handy dandy notebook right here. There are 4 women who are noted as prophetesses, if I'm saying that right. And they introduce, when you know that someone is saying something that God has given them, they introduce it as God's, always. These women specifically, the Lord said to me to tell you. That introduction, however it's worded, is almost the same. The Lord told me to tell you, Sally told me that Jim, right? So, Old Testament female prophets. In fact, I didn't actually know most of these names. The only one I recognized was Deborah. And Deborah is mentioned in Judges. There's Miriam, she's mentioned in Exodus. Huldah, who's in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles. And Noadiah, which is mentioned in Nehemiah. I know I probably butchered that name. I'm so sorry. But the female leadership roles, they may not have been called a prophetess, but female leadership roles in the Old Testament, there was Ruth, and then there was Esther. And we always go back to those stories because they were the biggest representations of female leadership in the Bible. And they're wonderful. I highly recommend reading them, especially Esther, because she nearly got killed by her own husband. Crazy. So, and in the New Testament, the only one that I remembered was Junia, and she has maybe one line. She is an actual prophetess mentioned. And there is another one who's mentioned, Chloe. There's a couple. So Luke is more prominent in these. Luke mentions Anna, and there's Chloe, Junia, Priscilla, and Phoebe. So you probably know some women with these names. That's kind of cool. Not kind of, that's cool. Your name is cool. Okay. But those are more female leadership examples. They're not specifically called prophets, right? So remember, there's a difference between a teacher and a prophet. The prophets are the ones who are, the Lord told me to tell you. Teachers are, I know the word, and I'm going to teach you the word. I'm going to teach you about Jesus and show you what that means. And those women had to be educated. They had to understand how to read, and they had to understand how to speak and when not to speak. And there's verses in the Bible that have been pulled out of context and used to subjugate women. And there's verses from the Bible, again, at the same time, that have been pulled out of context to subjugate men. And we're seeing this dichotomy right now. It's kind of nuts. But when it comes to female roles in the church, what do you think? Like, it, should there be a cap? Should they be allowed in whatever role they want? What does that look like to you? I would really love to hear your thoughts on this, but because that's what I came up with, um, and that's just my perspective. But like, subscribe, comment, let me know what you think. I'd love to hear from you, and thanks for listening.